December 8, 1944. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The cold comes differently in the American South. Not the sharp, bone-cutting wind of a Berlin winter, but a damp chill that seeps through cloth and settles in the lungs like water. The transport trucks roll through the gates of Camp Ruston just after nightfall, their headlights cutting pale channels through the December darkness. Inside the canvas-covered beds, 47 women huddle together, silent except for the occasional cough or stifled sob. They are Nachrichtenfeldern Wehrmacht communications, auxiliaries captured 3 weeks earlier when Allied forces overran a signal station outside Aachen. They wear the same field gray uniforms they wore in service, now torn and filthy, marked with white paint circles that identify them as prisoners. Their faces are gaunt, eyes hollow with exhaustion and something deeper, the terror of women, who know what happens to the defeated when the trucks stop and the tailgates drop. Revealing American soldiers with rifles and flashlights, several of the women begin to pray. Not loudly, not dramatically, just whispered pleas in the darkness. Vater unser im Himmel, because they have been prepared for this moment, told what to expect. They know the stories. Every German soldier knows them. Stories of what the Soviets do to captured women. Stories whispered in bunkers and barracks. Stories printed in Das Schwarzkorps and broadcast on German radio. Stories designed to stiffen resistance and justify atrocity. And if the Soviets are monsters, then surely the Americans cannot be far behind. The Americans with their mongrel army of blacks and immigrants, their democratic chaos, their absence of discipline. The women have been taught that capture means violation, that surrender means suffering, that the only thing waiting for German women in enemy hands is the degradation and death. So when Sergeant William Hayes, a 32-year-old former schoolteacher from Pennsylvania, steps forward and says in careful, accented German, "Please come down. You are safe now. No one will hurt you," they do not believe him. They cannot believe him. Belief requires trust, and trust requires a foundation. And 12 years of propaganda have demolished any foundation except fear. What happens in the next 72 hours will shatter that fear and replace it with something more dangerous. To the ideology that shaped these women. To understand the women who arrived at Camp Ruston that December night, one must first understand the architecture of lies that brought them there. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, though they had served the Wehrmacht with the same dedication as any man in field gray. The Nachrichtenfeldern program, established in 1940, had mobilized over 500,000 German women by war's end operating radios, managing communications networks, typing orders, decoding messages, performing the vast administrative labor that modern warfare requires. They were volunteers, mostly young, mostly educated, drawn by patriotism and propaganda into service for a Reich that promised them glory and demanded everything. Among the 47 women at Camp Ruston was Anneliese Muller, 24 years old, daughter of a Lutheran pastor from Württemberg. She had joined the Nachrichtenfeldern in 1942, believing she was serving God and fatherland in equal measure. She had logged radio transmissions from the Eastern Front, typed casualty reports, forwarded ammunition requests. She had never fired a weapon, never seen combat, but she had enabled those who did. And when the Allied armies closed in on Aachen, she had been ordered to destroy documents, burn codebooks, and retreat. There had been no retreat, only capture. Only the moment when American soldiers burst through the door of the signal station with weapons raised, and voices shouting commands in a language she barely understood. The journey from Aachen to Louisiana had been a blur of holding cells, interrogation rooms, transport ships. Anneliese remembered the crossing most clearly. 8 days on a converted freighter, confined below decks with hundreds of other prisoners, the air thick with vomit and fear. The American guards had been correct, even professional, but distant. They had provided food, not much, but more than the German army had given its own troops in recent months, and medical care for those who needed it. But they had not been kind. Kindness was not part of the machinery of war. What Anneliese remembered most was the silence among the women. They did not speak of what they expected. They did not need to. They all knew. The Reich had told them explicitly, in language stripped of euphemism, American soldiers, especially the colored troops, were savages. They would rape and murder German women without mercy. Better to die fighting, the propaganda said, than to fall into enemy hands. Better the cyanide capsule than the American prison camp. So when the truck stopped at Camp Rustin and the tailgates dropped, Anneliese had prepared herself for the worst. She had prayed. She had whispered goodbye to a sister she would never see again. She had steeled herself for violation. And then Sergeant Hayes had spoken to them in German, his accent strange but his meaning clear. "You are safe now." She did not believe him. None of them did. The first night at Camp Rustin passed in a kind of suspended horror. The women were processed through an administrative building, names recorded, possessions catalogued, identification tags issued. American nurses, women in starched white uniforms with Red Cross armbands, conducted medical examinations. They were gentle but thorough, checking for lice, disease, malnutrition. They asked questions through interpreters. "Are you injured? Are you ill?" And seemed genuinely concerned with the answers. This confused Anneliese. Where was the brutality? Where were the leering guards, the casual violence, the degradation she had been promised? After processing, the women were led across the compound to their barracks. It was full dark now, past midnight, the Louisiana winter settling cold and damp over the camp. The barracks itself was a long wooden structure, painted olive drab, surrounded by chain-link fence and watchtowers. The women filed inside, silent and afraid, expecting the worst. Instead, they found bunks. Real bunks with mattresses and pillows. Not straw-filled sacks on bare boards, but actual mattresses. And on each bunk, folded neatly, were 2 wool blankets. American Army blankets, olive green, slightly scratchy but clean and thick. Enough to keep a person warm through a southern winter night. Anneliese stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the blankets. Around her, the other women had stopped moving. They looked at the bunks, at the blankets, at each other. Confusion rippled through the group, visible as any wave. "It is a trick," someone whispered in German. "They want us to feel safe before." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to, but as the minutes passed and nothing happened, no guards entered, no orders were shouted, no violence erupted, the women began, tentatively, to claim bunks. Anneliese chose one near the back, away from the door. She sat on the mattress, it compressed beneath her weight, soft in a way she had almost forgotten, and picked up one of the blankets. It was heavy, real. She held it to her face and smelled it. Wool and laundry soap and something indefinably clean. No smell of blood or fear or death. Just blanket. She began to cry. Quietly at first, then harder, great shuddering sobs that she tried to muffle against the wool. Around her, other women were doing the same. Not all of them. Not even most. But enough that the sound filled the barracks, a chorus of weeping, of tension released, of terror confronted and found wanting. They had expected abuse. They had prepared for torture, rape, murder. They had been told that American captivity meant suffering. Instead, they had been given blankets. It was the smallest thing. The most ordinary thing. In the calculus of war, 2 wool blankets were nothing, a line item in a quartermaster's ledger. Standard issue for any prisoner in American custody, mandated by the Geneva Conventions and military regulation. But to women raised on 12 years of lies, taught that the enemy was subhuman, prepared for atrocity, those blankets were a revelation. They were evidence of a world that did not match the propaganda. They were proof that the stories had been wrong. That night, wrapped in American wool, sleeping on American mattresses, guarded by American soldiers who did not rape or beat or kill. Anneliese Muller began to doubt everything the Reich had ever told her. The transformation did not happen all at once. Trust is not built in a single night, no matter how many blankets are distributed. The women woke the next morning still wary, still half convinced that yesterday's kindness was a prelude to today's cruelty. But when breakfast arrived delivered by camp staff, served in a mess hall that smelled of coffee and fried food, the doubt deepened. The meal itself was simple by American standards: oatmeal with brown sugar, bread with margarine, coffee, canned fruit. But to women who had endured months of declining rations in a collapsing Reich, who had lived on black bread and ersatz soup, who had watched Wehrmacht supply lines crumble and soldiers go hungry, the abundance was staggering. There was enough. Not just barely enough. Enough. Seconds were available for those who wanted them. The coffee was real coffee, not acorn substitute. The bread was soft. The fruit canned peaches, swimming in syrup, tasted like a memory of peacetime. Anneliese ate slowly, savoring each spoonful of oatmeal as if it might vanish. Across the table, another woman, Greta Schmidt from Hamburg, stared at her coffee cup with an expression somewhere between wonder and grief. "How?" she whispered. "How do they have so much?" It was the question that haunted all of them. The Reich had told them that Germany was winning, that final victory was inevitable, that shortages were temporary. But here, in an enemy prison camp, there was more food than German civilians had seen in years. More than German soldiers had. The arithmetic did not work. Either the propaganda had lied about the war's progress, or it had lied about American weakness. Probably both. After breakfast, the women were assembled for orientation. A camp administrator, a major named Roberts who spoke through an interpreter, explained the rules. They were prisoners of war, subject to the Geneva Conventions. They would not be forced to work, but could volunteer for labor in exchange for small wages. They would receive mail, could write letters home censored, but permitted. They would have access to medical care, to religious services, to recreation. They would be treated, the major said, with the dignity afforded to all prisoners under American custody. "We do not make war on women," Major Roberts said, his words translated into formal German. "You are here because of circumstance, not crime. You will be returned to Germany when the war ends. Until then, you are under the protection of the United States Army." Protection. The word sounded strange in German Schutz. Anneliese turned it over in her mind. The Reich had promised protection too, protection from the chaos of democracy, from the weakness of liberalism, from the corruption of Jewish influence. But that protection had come wrapped in barbed wire and backed by firing squads. It had required absolute obedience, absolute conformity, absolute surrender of individual will. This American protection seemed different. It asked for nothing except compliance with basic rules. It did not demand ideological purity or racial loyalty. It simply existed, a baseline of human decency extended even to enemy prisoners. Over the following days, the pattern repeated and solidified. Meals arrived on schedule, 3 times a day, every day, with enough food that no one went hungry. The barracks were heated. Medical care was provided without charge or cruelty. A dentist visited the camp and treated those with dental problems, pulling infected teeth and filling cavities with the same care he would give American soldiers. When one of the women, a girl named Liesel, who could not have been older than 19, fell ill with pneumonia, she was transferred to the camp hospital and treated with sulfa drugs, expensive, modern antibiotics that German forces no longer had in sufficient supply. She recovered. Slowly, incrementally. The women's fear transformed into confusion, and confusion into reluctant acceptance. This was not the American captivity they had been promised. There was no sadism, no casual cruelty. The guards were professional, but not brutal. The camp commandant, Colonel Daniels, made regular inspections and addressed complaints. When one of the women reported that a guard had made an inappropriate comment, the guard was reprimanded and reassigned. The system worked. Not perfectly, nothing human is perfect, but well enough that survival was not in question, and every night, the women returned to their bunks and wrapped themselves in those olive green blankets. And the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The blankets were warmth without condition, comfort without cost, a small manifestation of a larger truth, that the American system, for all its flaws, operated on principles different from the Reich, that abundance, not scarcity, was its foundation, that its wealth was so vast it could afford to treat even enemies with basic humanity. The historical record of German POW camps in the United States is extensive and well documented. Between 1942 and 1945, over 371,000 German prisoners were held in some 511 camps across the continental United States. The camps ranged from large installations like Camp Rustin, which housed thousands, to smaller branch camps attached to military bases or agricultural areas where prisoner labor was needed. The treatment of German POWs in American custody was governed by the Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States adhered to strictly not out of altruism alone but from practical recognition that adherence encouraged reciprocal treatment of American prisoners. German POWs in the United States received the same rations as American soldiers. They were paid for their labor 80 cents per day in scrip that could be spent at camp canteens. They had access to recreational facilities, libraries, education programs. They could form orchestras, theater groups, sports teams. Mail service was maintained. Red Cross inspections were regular and unannounced. The mortality rate among German POWs in American custody was remarkably low, less than 1%, most from natural causes or pre-existing conditions. This was not mercy. This was policy. The American military establishment understood that mistreatment of prisoners served no strategic purpose and violated the legal frameworks to which the United States had committed. Moreover, good treatment had practical benefits. Well-treated prisoners were more likely to cooperate, less likely to attempt escape, more willing to work. And perhaps most importantly, knowledge of good treatment undermined enemy morale. German soldiers who knew that capture by the Americans meant survival were more likely to surrender than those who believed capture meant death. But policy, however enlightened, operates in the abstract. For the women at Camp Rustin, the experience was intensely personal. They did not think in terms of Geneva Conventions or strategic calculations. They thought in terms of bread and blankets, coffee and kindness. The absence of fear that had defined their last months of service to the Reich. Anneliese began keeping a diary. Writing in the margins of a notebook provided by the Red Cross, her entries, preserved and later translated, offer a window into the transformation occurring behind the wire. December 15th, 1944. We have been here 1 week. I still cannot believe what I see. The American soldiers do not hate us. They are not cruel. Some barely look at us. Others smile. One, a young man with red hair, helped me carry a box yesterday. He said, "Excuse me" in German and moved aside when I passed. As if I were a person. Not an enemy. Not a thing. A person. December 20th, 1944. Christmas is coming. At home, we would have Advent wreaths and stolen bread. Here, the Americans are decorating the mess hall. They brought a tree, a real pine tree, enormous, and have strung it with lights that glow like stars. They are allowing us to participate, to make ornaments from paper and tin. I do not understand these people. We are at war with them. We have killed their brothers and sons. And they give us a Christmas tree. December 25th, 1944. Today they served a feast. Turkey, the Americans call it. A great bird roasted with stuffing and potatoes and vegetables and pie. More food than I have seen in 2 years. The camp commandant came to our barracks and wished us Frohe Weihnachten. Merry Christmas. He spoke German poorly but earnestly. Some of the women cried. I did not. I sat and ate and tried to understand how we could have been so wrong about everything. The Christmas celebration at Camp Ruston in 1944 was not unique. Across the United States, German POWs were experiencing similar treatment. At some camps, prisoners were allowed to attend local churches. At others, American citizens, often German Americans themselves, organized visits and gift deliveries. The International Red Cross documented these practices extensively, noting in their reports that conditions in American POW camps were excellent and in full compliance with international law. But for women raised in the Third Reich, educated in National Socialist ideology, taught that democracy was weakness and racial hierarchy was destiny, this treatment was incomprehensible. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could the Americans, who were supposed to be decadent and weak, be winning the war? How could the mongrel democracy, which was supposed to collapse under its own contradictions, be producing such abundance? How could the enemies, who were supposed to be inhuman, be showing such humanity? The blankets became a symbol of this contradiction. Every night, wrapping themselves in that olive green wool, the women confronted the evidence that everything they had been told was a lie. By January 1945, the psychological transformation was nearly complete. The women had not become Americans, they were still German, still shaped by culture and language and identity. But they had stopped being National Socialists. The ideology that had sustained them, the certainty that had carried them through war, had crumbled in the face of daily evidence to the contrary. Greta Schmidt, the woman from Hamburg who had wondered at the coffee, began speaking openly about her disillusionment. They told us the Americans were animals, she said one evening in the barracks, that they would treat us like dogs. But we are the ones who made the camps. We are the ones who murdered people for their race. Not the Americans, us, and I helped. I typed the orders. I forwarded the messages. I knew. We all knew. Her words hung in the air like smoke. Several women turned away, unwilling to confront the implication. But others nodded. The truth was unavoidable now. The Reich had committed atrocities. Not just tactical brutality, not just the ordinary cruelties of war, but systematic, industrialized murder. The camps, not POW camps, but the other kind. The camps that every German soldier knew about, even if they did not speak of them, had been real. The stories dismissed as allied propaganda were true. And the women who had served the Wehrmacht, who had enabled the machinery of war, bore some measure of responsibility. Anneliese wrestled with this realization in her diary. January 8, 1945. I have been asking myself what I knew and when I knew it. The deportations, the whispers, the empty houses in town where Jewish families once lived. I told myself I did not know where they went. I told myself it was not my business. I told myself I was just a communications auxiliary, just typing messages, just doing my job. But I did know. Not the details, not the full horror, but enough. Enough to suspect. And I said nothing. I did nothing. Because I was afraid, yes, but also because I believed. I believed we were right. That Germany was destined to rule. That the others were less than us. And now I am here, in an enemy prison, being treated with more humanity than my own government showed to its victims. The shame is unbearable. This was not an isolated sentiment. As the months passed and news of the war filtered into the camp, Germany retreating, cities falling, the Reich collapsing, many of the women underwent similar reckonings. They could not escape the arithmetic. They had served evil. They had enabled atrocity. And the nation that had defeated them, the nation that they had been taught to despise as weak and mongrel and degenerate, was proving itself not just militarily superior, but morally superior. The blankets, though simple, olive green, scratchy wool blankets, became a constant reminder. Each night, pulling them close against the Louisiana winter, the women confronted the evidence of American abundance and American decency. The blankets were not propaganda. They were not theater. They were just blankets, distributed without fanfare, without expectation of gratitude, simply because military regulation and basic humanity required it. In February 1945, the Red Cross organized a letter-writing campaign. The women were allowed to write home, to families in Germany, letters that would be censored but delivered. Anneliese wrote to her father, the Lutheran pastor, and tried to explain what she had learned. "Dear Vadi, I am safe and well treated. The Americans are not as we were told. They have shown us kindness when they had no reason to. I am beginning to understand that we were lied to. About many things. When this war ends, when I come home, if there is still a home to come to, we must rebuild. Not the Reich, something else. Something true. Something that does not require lies to sustain itself." She did not know if the letter reached him. Hamburg, where her family lived, would be bombed into rubble by July. She would not learn until after the war that her father had died in the firestorm, that her mother and sister had survived but been left homeless, refugees in their own country. But the sentiment in the letter was real. The women at Camp Rustin, isolated from the collapsing Reich, had begun to imagine a different future. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. News reached Camp Rustin the following day. The women gathered in the mess hall to listen as Major Roberts, through an interpreter, announced the unconditional surrender of Germany. Some wept, some sat in stunned silence. A few cheered, quietly, the relief of survival overwhelming the grief of defeat. "You will be repatriated as soon as transport can be arranged," Major Roberts said. "Germany is under Allied occupation. Your homes, many of them, have been destroyed. Your country is divided. The road ahead will be difficult. But you are alive. That is not nothing." In the weeks that followed, as the women waited for transport back across the Atlantic, the camp administration began offering education programs, English lessons, courses on democratic governance, lectures on American history and constitutional law. Attendance was voluntary. Many women attended. They had time and nothing else to do, but more than that, they were curious. How had this system, this chaotic democracy, prevailed over the Reich's disciplined authoritarianism? What were the mechanics of a government built on consent rather than coercion? Anneliese attended every lecture. She learned about the separation of powers, about federalism, about the Bill of Rights. She learned about the messy, argumentative, inefficient process of democratic governance, a process that had somehow managed to mobilize 12 million men, produce a war machine of unprecedented scale, and defeat two empires simultaneously. She learned that freedom was not the same as chaos, that diversity was not weakness, that a society built on voluntary cooperation could outperform one built on forced obedience. In her diary, she wrote, May 30th, 1945, "We were taught that democracy would collapse, that it was too weak to survive crisis. We were taught that only authoritarian strength could forge a great nation. But the Americans have proven otherwise. They argued with each other throughout the war. I have heard the guards talk about elections, about political disputes. And yet they won. They produced more, fought harder, endured longer. Not because they were forced to, because they chose to. There's a strength in that which we never understood. A strength rooted in the dignity of individual choice. The Reich tried to make us all into cogs in a machine. But machines break. People, when they are free, adapt. This was the essential lesson, the truth that the blankets had symbolized from the first night. The American system was built on abundance, material abundance. Yes, but also an abundance of trust, of opportunity, of dignity afforded to individuals regardless of race or class or birth. That abundance created resilience. It allowed for error, for debate, for the messy process of collective decision-making. And in a prolonged conflict, that resilience proved decisive. The Reich had promised efficiency, unity, strength through hierarchy. And for a time, it had achieved stunning victories. But authoritarian systems are brittle. They cannot admit error. They cannot tolerate dissent. They cannot adapt to changing circumstances without exposing the lies that hold them together. When the Reich met sustained resistance, when its initial advantages eroded, the system cracked. The lies became obvious. The hierarchy collapsed. The machine seized and stopped. The Americans, by contrast, had muddled through. They had argued and debated and sometimes failed. Their military planning had been imperfect. Their strategies had evolved through trial and error. But the system itself, the democratic, capitalist, individualist system that the Reich had mocked as weak, had proven capable of self-correction. When something did not work, they changed it. When they needed more production, they asked their citizens, and their citizens responded. Not because they feared punishment, but because they believed in the cause. And they had won. Not through superior will or racial destiny, but through superior systems. Through abundance. Through freedom. In July 1945, Anneliese Muller and 46 other women boarded a transport ship in New Orleans and began the journey back to Germany. They carried with them the possessions they had accumulated during months in captivity: letters, photographs, small gifts from Red Cross packages. Some carried books, primers on English or American history. And many carried blankets. The same olive green army blankets that had greeted them on that first terrifying night at Camp Rustin. The camp administration had told them they could keep the blankets. "You will need them," an officer said. "Germany is cold in winter, and there's not much left." The crossing took 9 days. The ship was crowded, converted cargo space filled with repatriated prisoners, men and women, soldiers and civilians, all heading home to a country that no longer existed in the form they remembered. Anneliese stood on the deck as the ship approached Bremerhaven, watching the German coast materialize through morning fog. The city was ruins. Shattered buildings, collapsed bridges, rubble stretching as far as the eye could see. The harbor was choked with half-sunken ships. The smell of smoke and decay drifted across the water. She clutched her blanket tighter. It was the only warm thing in a world gone cold. The women disembarked and were processed through a British military checkpoint. From there, they scattered, some to refugee camps, some to relatives in the countryside, some into the vast displaced population of post-war Germany. Anneliese made her way to Hamburg, or what remained of it. She found her mother and sister living in the basement of a bombed-out building, surviving on Allied rations and black market trade. Her father was dead. Her childhood home was ash. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years had lasted 12 and left nothing but graves, but she still had the blanket. And in the years that followed, as Germany rebuilt under Allied occupation, as democracy was imposed and then gradually haltingly embraced, Anneliese kept that blanket. She used it through the brutal winter of 1946-47, when hunger and cold killed thousands. She wrapped her children in it when they were born. She brought it with her when she immigrated to the United States in 1953. A decision that would have been unthinkable in 1944, but which now seemed inevitable. In 1987, 42 years after the war ended, a researcher from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., interviewed Anneliese as part of an oral history project. She was 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher, grandmother of 5. The interviewer asked her about her wartime service, her capture, her experience in American POW camps. And Annalise told the story, the fear, the propaganda, the expectation of abuse. And then she told about the blankets. "I still have mine," she said, her English accented but fluent. "I keep it in a closet. My husband, he says throw it away. It is old and scratchy. But I cannot. Because that blanket taught me something. It taught me that the world does not have to be the way the Reich said it was. That people can be decent to each other, even enemies. That abundance is possible, that cruelty is not inevitable, that freedom is not weakness. That blanket, it was just a blanket. But it was also proof. Proof that we had been lied to. And proof that another way was possible." The interviewer asked if she felt guilt for her service to the Wehrmacht. Annalise was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said. "Every day. I did not kill anyone. I did not run the camps. But I was part of the machine. I enabled it. And I cannot undo that. All I can do is tell the truth now. Tell what I saw. Tell what I learned. That the Reich was evil. That we were lied to. That the Americans, who we were taught to hate, showed us more humanity than our own government. That the blankets, the food, the kindness, it was not propaganda. It was real. And it mattered." She paused, then added, "I tell my grandchildren this story. I show them the blanket. I want them to understand that ideology can make you blind. That what you are told to believe is not always true. That you must see with your own eyes, think with your own mind. And that sometimes, in the smallest gestures, a blanket, a cup of coffee, a moment of kindness, there is more truth than in all the propaganda in the world." The story of German POW women in American camps is a footnote in the larger narrative of World War II. It lacks the drama of D-Day, the tragedy of the Holocaust, the apocalyptic finality of Hiroshima. But it contains within it a truth as important as any, that the contest between democracy and fascism was not merely military but moral. That the American system, for all its flaws and contradictions, offered something the Reich could not match: a baseline of human decency, an abundance of material and moral resources, a resilience rooted in freedom rather than fear. The women who expected abuse and received blankets instead learned this truth experientially. They could not argue with it. They could not dismiss it as propaganda. They lived it, night after night, wrapped in olive green wool that should not have existed in the narrative they had been taught. Those blankets were evidence. Evidence that the world was larger and more complex than ideology allowed. Evidence that the enemy was human. Evidence that the Reich had lied, and in the end, that evidence multiplied across millions of individual experiences. German and Japanese soldiers who surrendered and found mercy. Prisoners who expected death and received food. Women who feared rape and got blankets did more to discredit fascism than any number of speeches or manifestos. Because fascism is built on lies. It requires a narrative of scarcity, of enemies, of existential threat. It cannot survive abundance. It cannot withstand kindness. When confronted with evidence of a world where resources are sufficient and people are decent, the fascist narrative collapses. The blankets at Camp Rustin were not unique. They were standard issue, distributed according to regulation, part of the vast logistical machinery of the American war effort. But to the women who received them, they were revolutionary. They were the small, tangible proof that another world was possible. A world not ruled by fear. A world where even enemies could be treated with dignity. A world built on abundance rather than scarcity, on freedom rather than coercion. On the simple recognition that every human being, regardless of nationality or race, deserves warmth on a cold night. That is the lesson written in those olive green fibers. That is the truth Annalise Muller carried with her for the rest of her life. That is the story worth telling, not because it is heroic or dramatic, but because it is true. Because in a war fought over the future of civilization, the victors proved themselves not by their capacity for violence, though that was formidable, but by their capacity for humanity, by their willingness to extend, even to enemies, the basic decencies that fascism had deemed weakness. The women came to Camp Rustin expecting abuse. They left understanding that they had served a lie. And the instrument of that understanding, the symbol of their transformation, was the simplest and most ordinary thing imaginable: a blanket, warm, scratchy, olive green, American. Enough. She paused, then added, "I tell my grandchildren this story. I show them the blanket. I want them to understand that ideology can make you blind, that what you are told to believe is not always true, that you must see with your own eyes, think with your own mind, and that sometimes, in the smallest gestures, a blanket, a cup of coffee, a moment of kindness, there is more truth than in all the propaganda in the world." The story of German POW women in American camps is a footnote in the larger narrative of World War II. It lacks the drama of D-Day, the tragedy of the Holocaust, the apocalyptic finality of Hiroshima. But it contains within it a truth as important as any, that the contest between democracy and fascism was not merely military but moral, that the American system, for all its flaws and contradictions, offered something the Reich could not match: a baseline of human decency, an abundance of material and moral resources, a resilience rooted in freedom rather than fear. The women who expected abuse and received blankets instead learned this truth experientially. They could not argue with it. They could not dismiss it as propaganda. They lived it, night after night, wrapped in olive green wool that should not have existed in the narrative they had been taught. Those blankets were evidence. Evidence that the world was larger and more complex than ideology allowed. Evidence that the enemy was human. Evidence that the Reich had lied. And in the end, that evidence multiplied across millions of individual experiences. German and Japanese soldiers who surrendered and found mercy. Prisoners who expected death and received food. Women who feared rape and got blankets did more to discredit fascism than any number of speeches or manifestos. Because fascism is built on lies. It requires a narrative of scarcity, of enemies, of existential threat. It cannot survive abundance. It cannot withstand kindness. When confronted with evidence of a world where resources are sufficient and people are decent, the fascist narrative collapses. The blankets at Camp Rustin were not unique. They were standard issue, distributed according to regulation, part of the vast logistical machinery of the American war effort. But to the women who received them, they were revolutionary. They were the small, tangible proof that another world was possible. A world not ruled by fear. A world where even enemies could be treated with dignity. A world built on abundance rather than scarcity, on freedom rather than coercion. On the simple recognition that every human being, regardless of nationality or race, deserves warmth on a cold night. That is the lesson written in those olive green fibers. That is the truth Anneliese Muller carried with her for the rest of her life. That is the story worth telling, not because it is heroic or dramatic, but because it is true. Because in a war fought over the future of civilization, the victors proved themselves not by their capacity for violence, though that was formidable, but by their capacity for humanity. By their willingness to extend, even to enemies, the basic decencies that fascism had deemed weakness. The women came to Camp Rustin expecting abuse. They left understanding that they had served a lie. And the instrument of that understanding, the symbol of their transformation, was the simplest and most ordinary thing imaginable: a blanket, warm, scratchy, olive green, American. Enough.